Meet PitchDB, the ultimate platform for speakers looking to make their mark on podcasts, conferences, and media outlets. PitchDB provides access to over 3 million platforms, ensuring you find the perfect avenue for your message. With AI integrations, your bios and pitches are tailored uniquely to each opportunity, giving you the edge you need. Join now at pitchdb.com.
Welcome to Your Brand Amplified, the podcast where we interview marketers, publicists, and brands to learn their stories, what makes them tick, and tips and tricks that make a difference. When I look at Bob's profile, I see words like candid, emotional, engaging, motivating, purposeful, passionate, generous. And Bob, you have carved out a space for yourself as a chief generosity guy. So I'm really excited to have you on the show. And I needed to open with that because when I look at profiles, most guest tags or most ways people describe themselves aren't using those words. It's using words that they think will drive people to want to have them on a podcast, like expert in XYZ topic, right? So I just love that you lead with this language and this, you're opening up a new kind of conversation for us all to have. So Bob DePasquale, thank you for being here on Your Brand Amplified.
Annika, thanks for having me. I'm pumped to be here. And I love how you always start. I was listening to a couple of your episodes earlier, and you always start immediately with like the first thing you think about someone when you see them. And which is awesome. It's so transparent, candid. And it really is. It speaks to your skill, I believe, related to branding, because what is the first thing you think about people? That's what your brand is. So how powerful is that? Awesome stuff.
Yeah. Well, and you are a testament to all of these words that are descriptors that I see on your profiles in different places. And I've been lucky enough to be on your podcast, Speaking of Impact. You have your book in the background for anybody who's watching this episode, Personal Finance. I definitely want to talk about that. And I want to talk about how you're creating this narrative that I'm also very passionate about creating impact and how people as family units, as individuals, as businesses can do that. But let's rewind and go back to your start. You have a really powerful story, perseverance, and kind of how that shaped who you are. So please clue my listeners and viewers in.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about my story and kind of where you talked about being the chief generosity guy or generosity agent. And I think a lot of people's inspirational stories, I think we all have them. Mm-hmm. And most people's inspirational stories tell them how capable they are of doing something. And I think that's super powerful. Cool. What I realized in my life is, and in my story, and I'll be happy to share it here shortly, I realized how capable the other people in my life of doing things. Because without the network and the community and the people during this really challenging time in my life when I was 18, I literally would not be here today. And so I learned the power of other people in my story. And it also helps empower me as well, don't get me wrong. And it's a strong part of my brand. However, it's truly important to realize what the other forces and people in our life are capable of helping us do. And so that's why a lot of the reason why I like to tell my story, because I think it empowers people to create beautiful community around them. So I mentioned it happened when I was 18. And essentially, I think most people think that they're invisible. Excuse me, not invisible. As we come upon Halloween, I'm thinking about ghosts and costumes. Most people think they're invincible when they're 18, right? Yeah. I mean, did you feel that way when you were younger? Like you get your whole life ahead of you, nothing can take you down, right?
You do things that now you look back on and go, wow, I can't believe I put myself in that situation. Or I just thought I could, I'm going to age myself, but those were the days way before cell phones. And when parents didn't know where you were, and my friends and I would just go, oh yeah, we're going to drive from Kansas City to St. Louis or Chicago or wherever, or just to visit somebody we met once, or went to camp with or whatever. And our parents had no idea what we were doing. And I think back and I'm like, wow, we really did think we were invincible.
Yeah. My friends, a lot of the conversation was, well, I'm going to jump off this cliff or I'm going to, I'm going to do this stunt. And anyway, so the point is you think you're invincible. And at 18, I had most young people at that time have an opportunity to go to college. And I felt super blessed to be able to do that. And I grew up in South Florida, but I was actually born in New York. And I had an opportunity to go back to school up there. And I didn't really know my cousins and my aunts and uncles that well. part of the reason why I went up to school there is because of family. Part of it was because I had an opportunity to play football. And the other part of it was education. Now, I think my parents probably hoped that education was higher on that list. But I went up there for those three main reasons. And, little did I know at the time was I think there was another reason why I was actually there. But come to find out, a college football training camp is way different than a high school training camp, right? I mean, if you ever played high school football, you probably have, maybe one doctor, a medical person, and then a bunch of like student assistants type of volunteers. Well, in college, it's a whole nother animal. And I had, in the first couple of days of being up there as a freshman who's really a nobody, trying to prove myself to my new coaches and teammates. And I had what I thought was a groin injury. I thought I pulled a muscle. And I don't know if anyone's ever pulled a groin muscle, but that might be the first indication that you're not invincible in life. I mean, it's painful. You can't twist, stand up, sit down, and let alone run down a football field, right? So for about maybe 5 or 6 days, maybe a whole week, I was doing this rehab exercise. I mean, I couldn't practice. I felt like a loser, to be honest with you. Yeah. And I was doing this rehab exercise where I would sit on a 3-wheeled stool and I would shimmy across this training room. Now, it could be 100 people there on a given training camp morning at 5:30, 6 o'clock. I mean, there's commotion, craziness, loudness. And I'm doing this, what I thought was a stupid exercise. And at one point, our head trainer, who was a really small guy, but he's 5'5", 140 pounds soaking wet, maybe, not a big guy at all. And in order to get everyone's attention in this commotion, he would have to stand on top of like a small box and yell for who he was trying to get the attention of. Now, I'm not going to exaggerate anything in this story except for maybe this. I felt like it got dead silent at this one moment. It probably wasn't. It's probably just in my mind, but it felt like it was dead silent. And Rick, the trainer, stands on the box and he cups his hands. And they used to call me Bobby back then. He goes, "Bobby, quit messing around. You have to get back out on the field. You're acting like a weakling." Yeah. And he called me out. And in front of all my new teammates, like I said, felt like such a loser. The head trainer is calling me a weakling.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, this is terrible. Anyway, long story short, I ended up having a more private conversation with him. He said, "You know what? If you're not doing well," I said, "Yeah, something's not right. Like, you got to fix me." So he ends up saying, "I want to send you to a doctor just to be safe." So over a period of the next week or so, I had every test in the book. I mean, ultrasounds, CAT scans, sonograms, MRIs, you name it. Every test they could try to figure out what was wrong and how to fix my pulled muscle. But these appointments would take forever. I mean, I'm 18 years old, so technically I'm an adult, but it would take me hours to go in and out of these appointments and fill out medical paperwork and sit in the waiting room. And they're asking me all these health questions. I'm like, I don't know. I'm 18. I'm invincible. Like, there's nothing wrong with me. I eat and I exercise and I'm fine.
Right.
So I never forget this. The day that my parents were coming up for my first ever college game. Now, we knew I wasn't playing in the game at this point, but it was a Thursday. The game would have been on Saturday. They were coming up. They weren't going to cancel this appointment. They knew I wasn't playing, and I hadn't seen them. I'm a mama's boy, only child. I'd never been away from home this long. So obviously my parents were still going to come up to see me. So I go into an appointment that morning expecting to be there for, like I said, half the day, if not more. Mm-hmm. And I went in and I was in the waiting room I didn't even sit down. It's like they knew I was coming in, and I signed in and they brought me, I didn't even sit down. They brought me back to an office there. And I sat down in the office, and 30 seconds later, the doctor walks in. It's all happening so fast. I was not expecting this. And he sits down in front of me at the table and he looks me in the eye and says, "Bobby, you have cancer."
Oh my God.
And I said, "What? Cancer? Like, I'm 18. Like, what could possibly be wrong with me?" And he goes, "I know you're probably in shock, but don't worry. We're going to hook you up with an oncologist. You're free to go."
What?
And that's what he said to me. That was the doctor. And I thought to myself, I don't even know what an oncologist is. Like, how am I supposed to survive? Like, cancer, what? So I walked out of there probably as white as a ghost, speaking of Halloween. And it was like divine timing, Annika. I walked out of the building and my phone rings the moment I stepped outside. And it was my mom on the phone. And she said, "Hey, I wasn't expecting you to answer. I thought you'd be in the appointment, but I just want to let you know we've landed and we're on our way to your uncle's house," which was where we were going to meet. But she goes, "Since I got you on the phone, how did the appointment go?"
Oh, no.
And I'm like, so about that appointment, Mom. And obviously I had to tell her what the doctor told me. And she was dead silent. She didn't say a word on the other side of the phone, but I could just feel her like screaming inside. And the only thing I remember hearing was my dad on the other side, he was in the car with her. He was like, Susan, which is my mom's name. What's going on? Because he knew something was wrong too, because she was so quiet. And so we met back at my uncle's house, maybe 15, 20 minutes after that. And I saw my parents for the first time in over a month. And I gave them a big hug, and we shed some tears and said some prayers. And we thought to each other, like, what is going on? I mean, I'm supposed to be this 18-year-old kid, and now suddenly we don't know, my life is being threatened.
Right.
And so I tell you this whole story because the way I got through this time of my life was extremely unique. In fact, I didn't think I was going to be able to get through it, but I was able to. A couple of days later, my uncle's best friend came over his house. Now, this was the day of the game, but we didn't go. We were just sitting there in his house, and my uncle's best friend walks in the, like, just, you have a really good friend. They don't knock. They just kind of walk in the house, And this guy walks in and he's like, he says hi to my aunt and uncle, and they're like, oh, hey, Tim, how are you doing? Whatever. And they didn't even really have a chance to introduce him to us. And he walked over to my parents, like just walks in the door, walks over to my parents and pulls his keys out of his pocket. And he reaches out to my parents. It looked like he was shoving his keys in their face, but he was just handing to them. And he said, Bob and Susan, I can't imagine what you're going through with your son right now. Take my keys. You can have my car for as long as you need it.
Oh my gosh. And
my parents, I don't even think they said anything. They didn't even know what to say. And I thought to myself, I was like, wow, that's the most generous thing that someone's ever done for my family and I. And so that was it. Tim was there for maybe 15 minutes. He didn't even really introduce himself. He said goodbye to my aunt and uncle, and he left. And he was gone.
Okay.
And we were like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
And my uncle's like, well, that's Tim. He's my best friend. And, he's a pretty generous guy. I said, pretty generous? Man, he's radically generous. So Tim's gone. We spend the rest of the day trying to figure out what we're going to do with our life. We're planning out the next week because my college classes started. And the oncologist that we had already spoken with told me, don't drop out of all your classes.
Okay.
And then we were setting up doctor's appointments, all this stuff to do next week. And so that Tuesday came, and this is my second ever college class. I went to my first college class on Monday morning. Tuesday morning came, I was coming out of my second ever college class, and I was hungry. I knew I had some appointments later to go to, and I stopped at the cafeteria, and I got a breakfast burrito, and I'm sitting on like a tabletop, high top counter thing, watching the news. You remember those like old school tube type of televisions that would hang from a bracket, like in a public place? So there's this maybe 8-inch television hanging from a bracket between the ceiling and the wall there, and the news is on. Now, I don't know the news station because I don't live in New York. Also, I'm 18. I don't know any 18-year-olds that really want to watch the news, so I'm just watching it because it's on. But all of a sudden, there's a plane, and it hits a skyscraper. And I'm like, man, that's a terrible accident. So I called my dad. I said, hey, Dad, are you watching the news? And he was back at my uncle's, and he's like, yeah, I can't believe that happened. And all of a sudden, like, I don't know, less than a minute, we're talking. And all of a sudden, bam, another plane hit another skyscraper right next to the first one. We didn't know it at the time, but that was the September 11th terrorist attacks happening in New York, not too far from where we were. And I was like, oh, this is crazy. So my dad's like, that's not an accident. You better get in the car and get back to your uncle's. So I sprinted out of the cafeteria there. That breakfast burrito is probably still sitting on the counter. And I hopped in the car, and it typically would take me 15 minutes to drive from school to my uncle's house.
Mm-hmm.
But this trip took me 9 hours, and I'm in the car. Subsequently, I have a master's degree in broadcast journalism, and I actually worked in AM radio, and I liked it for a period of time. But that day, I listened to 9 straight hours of 9/11 coverage on AM radio, inching down the highway with burning towers in the distance. And I'll never forget that day. And I ran out of gas in my uncle's neighborhood 9 hours later. Now, thankfully, I didn't run out of gas on the highway. I don't know what would have happened then, but we pushed my car into my uncle's driveway. And my parents came out, or they were out there with me, and we looked at each other like, a few days ago, I was this invincible 18-year-old starting my life. Now I feel like my life might be over, but after today, maybe the world is over. I mean, it was nuts to be there at that period of time. And so my aunt was hysterical, flipping out because my uncle was on business the night before in Denver, and he was supposed to fly home that morning, and we could not get a hold of him.
Yeah.
And so she thought that he might have been on one of those planes. Well, it might have been 7 or 8 o'clock at night. He calls, And he says, guys, I'm okay. I know you're probably freaking out. The phones have been out. Really sorry, trying to get a hold of you, but I'm fine. Everything's good. They talked for a minute or two and we were getting ready to hang up. And he said, wait, before I let you go, though, I found out that my best friend, Tim, who you all met a couple of days ago, was in the towers this morning and he died. And we thought to ourselves, Tim, like, this guy did absolutely not deserve to be in the towers that morning.
Yeah.
He was this super generous guy, but he ended up losing his life. Now, come to find out, Tim worked for a investment firm known as Cantor Fitzgerald, and they were known for being pretty generous people there. And you can go out on YouTube if you're listening to the show right now and you want to hear more about the story. Howard Lutnick was the CEO, the number one guy over there. And he would have been in the office with all of his other colleagues that day. But he was taking, for some reason, on a random day, he had to take his kid to school, I think it was. And he ended up being one of those people that survived. He was out on the street when it happened. He ran away. But it's the most emotional press conference you've ever seen. And I bring that up because everyone from Cantor Fitzgerald, hundreds of people died that morning. And they were such a generous organization, they would donate office space to my uncle's foundation that he has for cystic fibrosis, which is a disease that my cousin has. And the only person that would typically be in the office for the foundation that morning was Tammy. But she was also uncharacteristically late that morning because something happened and she got caught in the subway underneath the towers and ended up surviving. And so I think about this time in my life all the time.
Yeah.
And I wonder, why was Tammy spared, but Tim wasn't? And if you've heard the term FOMO or YOLO, you only live once, fear of missing out, there's a lot of stuff out there that tells us that we need to take chances and just do stuff because we never know when life is over. And I generally agree with those. But Tim was known for saying something a little bit different with a little bit of a twist on it. And he would say, you never know when your last opportunity to be generous to someone will be. And it turns out that my family was Tim's last opportunity to be generous. And so that's why that period of time in my life was so powerful in my branding for today.
That's, I think all of us who were at an age where we can remember where we were at that moment in time will never forget. I have many friends who, for some reason or other, were not, were a little bit late to work that day, who were supposed to be in the tower, who walked miles and miles barefoot through the city. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that,
Me too.
that even though it took you 9 hours to drive, a 15-minute drive, that you and your family had this opportunity, to be so affected, I guess, by somebody else's positive generosity. And really, it's evident in your life how much this shaped your narrative. I lived in San Francisco at the time and was working, and I remember an upstairs neighbor yelling, and sometimes he would get up early and yell at the TV, and I was like, what is he doing? And then I turned on my TV to get ready for work and saw, and
wow.
Yeah, we all remember that time, and it's not easy to think about, right? Especially when you think about like what's going on in the world now and how people haven't learned these lessons. And I was going to ask you about radical generosity. You've explained that a little bit, but I'd like to hear how this continued to further shape you, your narrative, your family's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So people ask me this question in some form quite often. And I alluded to in the story earlier that I'm not going to exaggerate everything,
right?
Anything except for how quiet I felt like it was in that training room. I'm not going to exaggerate this either. Every day, literally every day, not stretching the truth at all, I think about that time in my life. Some days it's happy, it's a story of survival. Some days it's really sad, a story of loss. Other days it's encouraging, a story of camaraderie and the nation pulling together. And other days it's a threatening story where I feel not unsafe. As we record this podcast, where there's geopolitical issues going on all over the place. And, there's sometimes it reminds me of those situations where are we safe or not?
Yeah.
And I say that because the lessons that I've learned from that time weren't in those moments. In the moments that those things are happening, you're either fight or flight survival mode, like Tammy running and escaping from the subway.
Yeah.
Or you're just riveted and fascinated, like maybe your neighbor was, and he was so emotional about it because he just couldn't believe it was happening. And so in the moment, I don't know how much I learned, but since then, the lessons just keep on coming.
Right.
It took me 4, 5, 6 months. I mean, obviously I'm here, that's over 20 years ago, to recover physically, or at least for the treatments, for me to finish my treatment. I have a story about my oncologist talking about curing me, and that's a whole nother topic, but at least the treatment took about 4 or 5 months. It took me a couple of years to kind of mentally work through all that, because I mean, as soon as I was done treatment, I was back playing sports and going to school full time and, just doing everything that a college kid was doing. I didn't really have too much time to even breathe, but the emotions took years. And I mean, it took such a long time to really sit down and think about it. And I've had conversations with my family. I've met or re-met and had conversations with Tim's children about it. And so you ask about how it has shaped and kind of affected my brand and just my life overall. It affects it every day. And I'm constantly pulling up new ideas and thoughts. And every time I tell the story, I tend to think a little bit deeper about what happened. So yeah, it's consistently affecting my brand. And the generosity piece is key. Radical generosity is one of those things where when you apply the word radical to certain things in the world, it gives them a bad connotation, right? Like a radical anger or, radical aggression. Like sometimes when you think radical, you think that's bad. Well, the definition of radical itself is really just, you can define it in a couple of different ways depending on which source you look at. But if you look it up on the internet, generally it's doing something or having a thought or idea or action that the average normal person probably wouldn't do. So it doesn't necessarily mean bad. In fact, it can be very, very good in some cases. And so I bring up radical generosity because I believe what Tim did for my family and I at that time was radical. I mean, most people would say, oh, here's an 18-year-old college kid who just got diagnosed with cancer. Let's do something nice for the family. Let's cook a meal for the family. Let's, maybe even give some money to their, now we didn't have those back then, but a lot of times there's, an online, place where they might be raising money for someone or just do something nice or a phone call. But the average person wouldn't just give them, the family, their car. I mean, that's radical.
That is radical.
Right?
Right.
So the lessons I'm learning from that period of time in my life continue to grow because I'm much, much more aware of radical, generous action. And it makes me realize that the most successful people, and I don't mean successful financially necessarily, although finance is in my background, if you want, like you said, we may talk about that, but I just mean successful in their own fulfillment and joy and definition of success. Whatever it is that they want to do in life, they're accomplishing it. They're using their gifts and skills for good. And I'm much, much more aware of that. And I've noticed the ones who do that and have the highest level of success are the ones that are thinking outside the box and taking radical action for what they believe in.
Now let's tie that into your world of finance, because a lot of times when people think about success, they do measure it by financial metrics. And you do have a background in finance and you do work with families, I imagine family offices and families who have acquired wealth to try to figure out how they're going to create impact out of that. So I'd love to hear what that looks like. But then I also love your framing because we're very specific. You said success doesn't have to be measured by finance. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your finance background and then how you balance both sides of the equation, like the financial success and making impact, but then how you've also just discovered that isn't necessarily the mark by which we should all be living our lives.
100%. And the first thing I'll say is I always encourage people and organizations. So if you're a leader, if you're an entrepreneur, business owner, brand builder, always have your own definition of success first. It doesn't mean the other sources out there can't be helpful, but you got to define it yourself so that you know where it is that you're going.
Right.
And it's never someone else's exact path, which is going to be your exact path of success. So that's vitally important. And I didn't always know that either, but I've certainly understood that much better over the past 5 years or so. Now, the reason why I'm in finance is really funny, actually. It's almost contradictory to what my original thought was. So I mentioned I have a master's degree in broadcast journalism, worked in sports radio. I thought if I wasn't going to be playing sports, I was going to be talking about it someday, like probably most invincible 18-year-olds. And so that's what I did. And I noticed that the radio conglomerate that I was working for was doing some questionable things with their money and the way they were treating advertisers and customers. And it wasn't necessarily illegal, I felt, but I just thought, I was like, man, I don't really like how things are running here. This probably isn't an organization that I want to spend the rest of my career with.
Interesting.
And so a recruiter had gone to the school that my wife works at, which is hilarious because my wife was teaching kindergarten or second grade at the time. She's a kindergarten teacher for most of her career. She might have been teaching second at that point, but he went into the office and he said to the office ladies, "Do you know anyone who would want to work in finance?" And they're like, "No, why are you at an elementary school recruiting?" Like, they're like, "This guy does not know how to do his job." Well, come to find out, he must have been really good at his job because he called my wife like immediately. It was in the middle of the day, so he must have left the office and called. He said, "Come on, you got to give us someone." And forgive me, I skipped this part. And they said, "Well, Mrs. DePasquale's husband's a nice guy.
Oh, okay.
So here's her number. Why don't you give her a call?" So he calls, and she couldn't answer. She was teaching. Later that day, she was like, "Hey, this strange guy called me. Just call him back. Be a nice guy." So I did call him back. And to this day, I don't know why I said this to him, but the only thing I remember saying to him was, "I'll call you back in 6 months."
Huh.
And I don't know why. I think it's just to get him off the phone.
Huh.
So 6 months goes by. It's the holiday, almost like the holiday season. And I had a couple of days off, which was rare in radio and at that stage of my career. And so I said, "You know what? My parents told me to be a man of my word.
Ooh.
I want to call this guy back."
Okay.
So I call him back, and I don't think he had any idea who I was. And he was like, I could just tell he was like fumbling through papers and notes, like, who is this guy? Someone actually called me back. And so he recruited me hard and wined and dined me. And because of what was going on with the money situation at the radio station, I said, "You know what? I'm going to go into the belly of the beast. Like, if they're messing with people's money and situations in the radio business, I can't imagine what they're doing in finance, in the world of money and investing and that sort of thing." So that was my thought. I thought I was going to be the savior to the world. I thought I was going to go figure out how to make everyone kind and nicer with their money. And that money is so important. And if we can just get everyone to be, on the up and up with their finances, then the world will be a better place. And that might be true to some degree, but man, was I wrong. I found out in short order that when I went to go work and start helping people, I was compensated to help them make wise financial decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I realized, Annika, that a lot of people want to be generous. They want to be kind. They want to be nice. There are people who are frugal, but most people would prefer to support other people when they're capable. The problem, though, was that most people thought they weren't capable, specifically financially. But I found out that it goes beyond just their finances. And this is what tells me that success and ability and community is built way beyond money. Money does not answer those questions. Mm-hmm. And so I realized that people just felt incapable of being generous with whatever resources it was, whether it was their time, their intellectual property, the products that their business sold, or their money. They just overwhelmingly, the majority of people felt, "I'm just not ready or I'm not capable." And it just killed me. It was debilitating. I thought I was going to go in and solve this other issue. I found out that's not the issue at all. Yeah. And so the brand, the thought, the idea behind the generosity in my financial career was that I want to help people put themselves in a position where they feel comfortable being generous. And it just so happens that my professional work and my expertise and my training is in the financial space, but it moves well beyond that. And that's why I still run my financial firm and I still want to help people. And that's our bread and butter. But at the same time, I also love talking with organizations about building a generous culture because I think it's really going to change the way the economy and the business world thinks, which is powerful for the rest of us.
It's super powerful. That's so interesting. And I love that because of your background and the things that happened to you, positive and negative, right? Really helped shape how you're able to advise people. You're not just going to get your paycheck to help advise people on finances, because I think a lot of people go into that world because they're like, I'm going to get a really good paycheck and maybe I'll make commission if I recommend certain products or, services for this person. But you're really helping them shape a legacy, not just a wealth building strategy, but a full legacy, something that they can pass on, values, right? That they can pass on in their families.
Totally. And I'm going to steal this from somebody. It's out there. It's a term maybe in the industry you heard of before, but we talk about net worth and building someone's net worth, so paying down your debts and investing money and trying to grow your wealth, your financial wealth, like you mentioned. Well, I heard someone once say, I want to help our customers build their net worthwhile.
Ooh, I love that.
And it always stuck with me. And so a lot of the work we do at Initiate Impact, which is our firm, is really helping people, like you said, I love the word legacy, helping them be great stewards of the resources that they have and try to grow their assets. That's vital. We would not be good at our job if we couldn't help people do that.
Right.
But the purpose behind growing their assets is key.
Mm-hmm.
What is the reason? What's the worthwhile? Why are you doing it? Is it to support another cause? Is it to build another business? Is it for your family? Is it for a legacy? Is it for now? There's so many questions. And we spend way, way more time talking about why people do things rather than implementing the strategies. If I'm being quite honest, technology and software and AI, there's so many tools these days that can help you actually implement that it takes way less time to do the implementation and way more time to figure out the strategy.
Yeah. And I imagine, I'm just thinking when I lived in Houston as part of the Greater Houston Community Foundation, and they had a program called Next Gen, and it was all about thinking about impact for families that were maybe had donor advised funds or family foundations or part of this giving because of the financial wealth that they'd built up in their businesses and maybe their family businesses, but then they also were very invested in the ideals that you're talking about, in figuring out how to further impact, how to create legacy, how to create net worthwhile. So do you work with a lot of community foundations? Do you work with family foundations? Do you work with individual, people who are just trying to figure out how to manage their money? Like, does it run the gamut in your practice day to day?
Yes. By the way, I love how you speak the language, donor advised funds and foundations. I mean, you clearly have an understanding of how these things work. And so, yes, a big part of the work that we do is helping families figure out great partnerships. Mm-hmm. I hesitate to use the word typical, but a typical investment advisor or financial planner or financial advisor or financial agent, there's so many different terms. But I mean, the table stakes is to help you make sure that you're insured and safe and that you're investing your money that you have in a good place. And it's the same concept with what we do, but instead of all of our partnerships, if you will, that we're choosing being other investment options or other companies to buy insurance products from, it's what are the companies that we can support or the organizations that we can support, whether it's a social impact for-profit organization or it's a nonprofit organization, or maybe like you talked about with Donor Advised Fund, which is a tremendous vehicle where you can invest your charitable dollars. You'll get your tax break in the year that you make that transaction, but you don't have to just give it all away at once. You might need time to think about it and figure out you may want to have ongoing gifts to organizations. So yeah, a lot of that strategy is paramount to what we do. And then the one other thing I'd like to add on this subject is that a lot of times the families that we work with, you talk about legacy, the matriarch, the patriarch, or someone in the family, that's not always necessarily the people who started the business, but they come to a point, they say, you know what? We know so much about this cause. We're ready to start something of our own.
Yeah.
And usually my advice is, okay, before you go out on your own and try to start a nonprofit organization or a family foundation, consider supporting causes that already exist. But if they get to that point, a big part of our work is helping them do that, decide which the structure of the organization that they want to start, and then figuring out who can help them build the mission and legacy, like the word you used, of their family and their organization. And so it's really, really powerful work. Nothing gets me more excited about those conversations. I joke about this all the time. If someone comes to us and says, hey, Bob, if you can give me 5% on my retirement account for the rest of my life, I think I'll be happy. Usually I'm like, I don't know if that's a good fit for us.
Yeah.
But if they come to us and say, hey, Bob, we've had some success with our business. We really appreciate it, but there's something more than just the bottom line. We really care about this cause. Can you help us make a difference? That's what fires us up.
Yeah. I love that. Now let's pivot into how did you go from moving from radio into finance to writing a book, starting a podcast, and becoming a keynote speaker?
It all happened overnight.
Yeah.
I just...
of course, as always.
I snapped my fingers. No, I worked for a large financial organization for 12 years, the one that recruited me. And by the way, the guy who recruited me, he was with the company forever. And finally he retired. And one day, the year that he retired, we had our annual meeting and I had an opportunity to tell him more about the whole story. And he had no idea the whole story.
Oh my gosh.
And it was really, really cool to have that conversation. So anyway, John, God bless you, my friend. You really did change my life in a certain way. So I hope retirement is going well for you. But the transition kind of happened I think it was meant to be, but it was one of those things where we didn't expect it. So the pandemic hit, as those of you know, anyone who's listening is probably familiar. At this point, the coronavirus has its own strands and it's still out there. But if you remember when it actually happened, it was crazy.
Yeah.
My family and I were in China.
Oh.
December.
Okay.
So we're in China in December and we come back. My wife and I were terribly ill. I don't get sick. I was 18, nearly lost my life to cancer. Thank God I'm still here. But for whatever reason, I don't get the colds and flus. I never have. I've been super lucky in my life. But we came back from China, had no idea what was going on over there at the time. It's early January. We, for 2 weeks, were sick as a dog. Like, my wife, we've never been that sick. My wife had to take, like I said, she's a teacher. She had to take off from teaching. Come to find out, this thing called COVID-19 was out there and we were pretty sure that we had it, but we were covered and we were okay. That year for most people was nuts. Now I had been asking my employer to allow me to start a podcast for 5 years.
Oh, interesting.
But because of compliance and regulatory reasons, they're like, we don't want you talking about money, really anything. You can't do media. Writing a book was pretty much a no.
Wow.
It was very, very challenging. And that's all just for, we call it lowest common denominator compliance. Somewhere along the line, some dummy did something stupid, and now everyone in the future, because it's such a risk to an organization, can't do it anymore. So most people in our industry, and probably the legal industry, are probably familiar with this. So I was kind of had my hands tied, but I really did like the work that I was doing. So I was like, oh, you know what? I mean, I still want to be a broadcaster, like in the back of my mind. But so the pandemic hits, and I'm like just recovering from my illness, and I'm like, I sent this email, like ultimatum email, and I'm not the strongly worded email type of guy. You know, I'm pretty much, I try to be a little bit more cordial, but I was like, listen, guys, you're paying me to tell people about money. I haven't been able to start this podcast. I can't leave the house. The office is closed. No one wants to talk. You know, I need to talk to people. So you got to let me start this podcast. So my mom was working for us at the time. She was like our office manager and receptionist. And I'm in the back. I'm in my office in the back. And I got this email back from them that says, hey, Bob, we got your email. We understand what you're saying. We're going to let you start the podcast. And I screamed like joy, the most joyful scream you ever heard. And my mom comes running back to the office. Now my mom, I mean, God bless her, she still gets around very well, but seeing my mom run is rare these days. She runs into the back room. She goes, what happened? Like she thought I was like hurt or something. I was like, oh, they're going to let me start the podcast. So I was all excited. I sent him back an email. I said, terrific. We went back and forth. They're like, all right, give us a couple of weeks. We'll get all the logistics worked out and then we'll be good. So I'm all excited. I'm thinking about how I'm going to do this podcast about money and generosity and helping people with their finances and all that other stuff. They emailed me back 2 weeks later and I had the same like screaming response, except for it was negative this time.
Yeah.
Because they're like, Bob, we got everything set up. We got all the scripts written out. We got all this other stuff. And just remember, you can't say anything about money. And I was like, I can't say anything about money. Like that's the whole point. So I slept on it over the weekend. I think it was a Friday. I got the email. And over the weekend, I thought to myself, you know what? There's a million podcasts about money. Quite frankly, and I'm probably offending some of my friends in the industry, but most of them are kind of boring. And I really don't even want to just talk about money every week on a podcast. I'd rather talk about inspiration and positive impact in the world, like what people are doing to make a difference. And so that's when Speaking of Impact was born, the podcast. So you asked, like, how did this transition happen? So I actually did the podcast, started it before my business partner, Stacy, and I left our previous firm. And eventually we had a more serious conversation later that year. And it had nothing to do with the podcast, but I had this crazy idea one afternoon over the weekend again. I do a lot of thinking over the weekend, as you can tell. And our Monday morning meeting, it was now not in person, it was over the phone. And Stacy and I would have our meeting at 8:30 before the 9 o'clock meeting with the whole team would come in. And so I said, hey, Stacy, before we go through this management stuff, let me ask you a quick question. What would you feel like if we left and started our own company? And I expected her to say, you're nuts. But she goes, Bob, that's a great idea.
Amazing.
And I was like, what? I was almost as surprised as when the doctor told me I had cancer. I was like, what? Did you just say that? So in a short order, in just a few months, we put it all together and figured out it was actually possible. And that's when our firm, it actually wasn't born until the following year, but we had to do all the preparations and we had to start getting ready.
Right.
And so Initiate Impact was born shortly after that.
Nice.
And then now, suddenly I was able to do the podcast. I didn't have to, no restrictions. And I could do whatever I want. So I was like, well, I'm going to write a book now. because I'm allowed to. And so once I wrote the book and started getting some traction there, people started asking me to share and start talking about this. And then before you know it, I had some speaking engagements, and here we are. That's 2.5 years ago now.
And you're based in Florida, but do you work with families all over, nationally,
everywhere,
globally, everything?
Yeah, globally. So most of our families, actually, no, not most, all of them file a tax return and have residence in the United States, but many of them spend time in other places.
Yeah. So how has life changed since you've gone out on your own, started your own company, and really been able to fully expand and share everything that you want to share through the podcast, through the book, through these speaking engagements?
Yeah, I mean, I love it. My wife told me the other day, actually, no, this is probably 6 months ago now. My birthday's in April. And she goes, this birthday is not like, I don't have anything super special to celebrate. We're not going anywhere. I'm not really into that. So she was just like, I'm not going to do anything special. But I will tell you that this is probably the most joyful you've ever seemed or felt for your birthday in a while. So that told me right there that things had changed. Now, I did say I liked my work at my previous employer. So this is not bashing them at all.
Yeah.
Would be more than, in fact, I'm still a customer of theirs. So all my best friends in the industry work there. So, but I think the difference is I love to exercise. As you heard in my story, I was an athlete a long time ago, but this is my metaphor. So I felt in my previous role towards the end, I had some kind of injury that was causing me a lot of stress. It was holding me back. I couldn't do the podcast. I couldn't do certain things. People were asking us to offer services that I just described to you a few minutes ago that we just weren't allowed to do in that model. All we were really allowed to do was worry about retirement planning, investments, and insurance. Like that was what we had to focus on. But people were asking us to do other things, but it's kind of like I had a pulled hamstring or a pulled groin muscle, to stick with my story. And it was a painful stress. It hurt.
Right.
Because I couldn't help people. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not living the high life and everything's, I am stressed on a daily basis running my own business and setting up speaking engagements and traveling all over the place. Like there is stress there. Absolutely. So I don't want to tell anyone out there that I'm not stressed, but that stress to me is more like working out. So instead of pulling a hamstring, I'm now running and I'm tired, or my hamstring is sore from working out.
You're building a stronger foundation. Stronger. You got the metaphor. That is it. Now I'm doing strengthening exercises as opposed to rehabbing an injury. Yeah. And I love it. I love it. Fantastic. Well, if somebody wanted to work with you for Initiate Impact, right? Or have you guest speak, is there kind of a minimum threshold that they need to have in their retirement fund or financially? Or do you also help people future forecast if they're just starting out and going, okay, this is what I'm going to be doing. I want to start setting this into motion now, even though I'm not making that income yet.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. So if you go to our website, initiateimpact.com, there's a pricing and menu of services, and you'll see the different services that we provide. We have plenty of free information for people that just want to get to know what we're doing and are, like you say, maybe starting out. If the services that we're providing would not actually be helpful to you, I think you'll pretty quickly understand that. But you can still be part of our online community that will provide information as you need it. And then as things come up and you have questions, maybe one of our service levels will be provided for you. You talk about minimums. We manage people's money if need be, but we have no requirements of the amount of money you're investing with us. We're compensated strictly on a subscription model. So you pay us a fee. Most people will pay monthly, but it's not based on your net worth it's not based on the amount of investments you have with us. So you might have all your investments tied up in your business or real estate or at another company, but you want our advice and you want our partnership. And so that's completely different.
Oh, I love that. That's such a different model. And I think that there's a comfort level in that. Because I think that a lot of these companies, when you start moving into this world and trying to figure out who to work with, there can be a lot of judgment and preconceptions. And I feel like the model that you have is there's a level of comfort that I could come and not feel judged and get advice from you, even if I'm still building, right? That's beautiful. So thank you for structuring your company. Yeah. It's revolutionary.
Well, one of the things we wanted to do is make it really clear and understandable for people. And I don't think you can eliminate every conflict of interest when it comes to our service, but we try to eliminate as much as possible. And so there's no incentive for us to tell you to move money and put it in different areas based on our own compensation. So we wanted to make sure that was off the table.
There are so many other questions I could ask, things we could get into, but I know we are a little bit past the time that I promised you we'd be on this call. So with that, I wanted to find out, we talked about your website. Is there anywhere else that you want to direct people to follow you? And do you have a favorite quote, family motto, mantra, verse, some words of wisdom that you live by that you could share with us?
Yes, absolutely. So to answer your question about the website, initiateimpact.com is the company website. Bob DePasquale, if you're interested in me speaking to your organization or you want to follow me on social, that's all on my personal site. And my favorite quote comes up a lot is, you may not change the world, but you may change the world for one. So never underestimate your ability to make a life-changing move for yourself or someone else.
Fantastic. Bob, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's so powerful. And it really shows what someone can do with the gift that they're given, whether that gift is life, generosity, radical generosity from somebody else, and how that really has shaped a lot of your narrative. And I can't wait to read your book as well, Personal Finance in a Public World. Everybody needs to know more about personal finance. I don't think you can ever read too much on the topic. But more than that, the fact that you are speaking to people through your podcast and through everything else that you're doing to really truly think about what wealth means to you, what success means to you, and what impact we can all impart in the world. So thank you for a very powerful discussion, Bob DePasquale. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly this time. And I'm Annika Jackson. Thank you to my viewers and listeners for coming back for another episode of Your Brand Amplified. And I'll be back again in a few days with another amazing guest. Want more? Check out amplifywithannika.com or follow me on socials at amplifywithannika.